Can you imagine what it means to wake up every day, not knowing if you'll still be alive by nightfall? That was the brutal reality for thousands of men who chose to live under the black flag between the 16th and 18th centuries. But what truly led them to abandon everything for a life of plunder and constant danger at sea? The answer isn't as simple as it seems. When we dive into historical accounts and the journals left behind by these men, we discover that life on a pirate ship was a fascinating paradox, a peculiar mix of radical democracy and absolute tyranny, of unimaginable riches and extreme misery, of total freedom and lifelong imprisonment on the endless waters of the ocean. But before we explore these contrasts, we must confront an uncomfortable truth. Not all pirates chose that life. Many were forced into it by circumstances that would drive any man desperate enough to embrace crime as his only means of survival. Imagine John Williams, an ordinary sailor in the British Royal Navy in 1720. After months at sea with delayed pay, rotten food and brutal punishment for minor infractions, his ship is attacked by pirates. When the pirate captain offers him a choice, join the crew or be left on a deserted island, what do you think his decision would be? That scene played out thousands of times, creating a population of involuntary pirates who gradually adapted to a new reality. But there were also those who actively sought this life, experienced sailors who had witnessed the injustices of both merchant and royal navies, where aristocratic officers treated the crew like livestock. For them, piracy represented something revolutionary, a society where a man's worth was measured by his courage and skill, not by his birth or wealth. And here we find the first paradox of pirate life. Though they were criminals in the eyes of the law, many pirate ships operated under codes of conduct that were more fair and democratic than any civilized institution of the time. How was that possible? The answer lies in the brutal need for survival. On a ship where each man literally depended on the others to stay alive, rigid hierarchies and injustices could mean mutiny and death for everyone. Thus were born the famous pirate codes, documents that regulated everything from how loot was divided to the punishments for crimes. Bartholomew Roberts, known as Black Bart, enforced one of the most detailed codes ever recorded. His rules included surprisingly modern points. Every crew member had the right to vote on important decisions. Those injured in battle received compensation based on the severity of their wounds, and there were even rules about alcohol consumption to maintain discipline. But did you know that these same codes also allowed for punishments, such as marooning a man on a deserted island for stealing from his comrades? Contradiction was constant. By day, a pirate might vote democratically on the crew's next target. By night, he might witness a crewmate being whipped nearly to death for disobeying a captain's order. This duality permeated every aspect of life on board. But what was daily life for these men really like? Waking up on a pirate ship was nothing like in the Hollywood movies. The first sound a pirate would hear at dawn wasn't tropical birdsong, but the constant slap of water against the hull and the groaning of ropes and wood under strain. The smell, a nauseating mix of sweat, tar, gunpowder, and rotting salted meat. The first task of the day was always the same, checking whether the ship was still seaworthy. You may not realize it, but 18th century wooden ships were essentially structures in constant decay. Every storm, every battle, every day exposed to sea salt caused damage that had to be repaired immediately. A small leak left unchecked could sink a ship in a matter of hours. That's why experienced pirates developed an almost military routine of maintenance. Crews rotated shifts, sealing cracks, replacing ropes, cleaning cannons, and checking supplies. But here's something that might surprise you. Pirates were often better sailors than their legal counterparts. Why? Simple. They couldn't count on friendly ports for repairs. Every crew member had to be a carpenter, a sailor, a gunner, and a medic when needed. This forced versatility created an interesting phenomenon. While a regular Navy sailor might spend years doing only basic tasks, on a pirate ship, he quickly learned skills that normally took decades to master. Some ex-pirates who eventually returned to legal life became the most respected captains of their time, precisely because of this diverse experience. But it wasn't all learning and camaraderie. Life on a pirate ship also included long weeks of absolute boredom. Imagine spending weeks at sea, sailing through empty waters without sighting a single sail on the horizon. No books, no entertainment, no news from the outside world. How did these men maintain their sanity? The answer came in the form of peculiar traditions they developed. Storytelling became an essential art, not only for entertainment, but to preserve important information about navigation, other pirates, and safe harbors. Card and dice games were common, but the stakes went beyond money. Extra work shifts, rum rations, even places in line for shore leave. Music also played a crucial role. Shanties, maritime work songs, weren't just fun, they were practical. Tools to coordinate tasks requiring perfect synchronization. When 20 men had to hoist a heavy sail together, the music set the exact rhythm. Some famous pirates were known as much for their fighting skills as for their ability to compose new songs. But when the monotony was broken by the sight of a potential prize on the horizon, everything changed instantly. Like a well-oiled machine, the crew took battle positions they had rehearsed hundreds of times. And here we come to an aspect of pirate life few truly understand. 18th century naval combat was a sensory experience completely different from modern warfare. First, the timing. A typical naval battle could last for hours. Ships would approach each other slowly, exchanging cannon fire at distances we'd now consider absurd. The sound was deafening, not just the booms of the cannons, but the crash of cannonballs splintering, wood, the whistle of flying debris, the screams of wounded men, the smell of burnt gunpowder mixed with the metallic stench of blood. But perhaps the most terrifying part was the unpredictability. A cannonball could pass through a ship from side to side, killing or maiming anyone in its path. Wooden splinters flew like knives, causing horrific injuries. Men could be talking normally 1 second and the next be dead or agonizing on the blood-soaked deck. Because of this, experienced pirates developed specific tactics to minimize casualties. They preferred quick approaches and psychological intimidation over prolonged battles. The famous black flag was not just a symbol, it was a psychological tool. When a potential victim saw that skull and crossbones on the horizon, they often surrendered without a fight, knowing resistance would mean certain death for everyone on board. But what happened after a successful capture? Here we discover another fascinating aspect of pirate life. The division of loot followed surprisingly sophisticated rules. It wasn't simply everyone grabs whatever they can. Specific codes determined how much each crew member would receive, based on their role, length of service, and contribution to the success of the operation. Captains typically received 2 or 3 shares of the loot. The quartermaster, a kind of second-in-command responsible for discipline and distribution, received 1.5 to 2 shares, and common sailors 1 full share. Gunners and carpenters, due to their specialized skills, often received 1.25 shares. It was a meritocratic system that many civilized societies of the time did not practice. But there were also rules about what to do with prisoners, and these rules reveal deep contradictions in pirate mentality. Merchant captains who treated their crews well were often released unharmed. Those known for cruelty could face brutal punishments or death. Women were generally protected and freed at the first opportunity, not out of chivalry, but because attacking women attracted unwanted attention from the authorities. Prisoners with useful skills were often invited to join the crew. Doctors, carpenters, and experienced navigators were rarely mistreated. On the contrary, they were treated as valuable resources. Some of the most famous pirates in history started as prisoners who gradually integrated into the crews. But not everything in the pirate world revolved around combat and loot. Long periods were spent in safe havens, remote islands or corrupt ports, where pirates could repair ships, sell goods, and simply relax away from the constant dangers of the sea. These interludes reveal another side of the pirate personality. Men who at sea were disciplined and focused on survival often became extravagant spenders on land. Entire fortunes were dissipated in a matter of days on drink, gambling, and women. Henry Morgan, one of the most successful pirates in history, was famous for parties lasting weeks, where gold and silver were literally thrown away in displays of wealth. This seemingly irresponsible attitude had deep psychological roots. When you live constantly under threat of violent death, when every day could be your last, the idea of saving for the future loses much of its appeal. Better to live intensely while possible than to die with buried treasures that will never be used. Speaking of buried treasures, here we find one of the greatest myths about pirates. Although some really did bury riches as a precaution, the vast majority spent everything quickly. Treasure maps with an X marking the spot were extremely rare. The reality is that pirates preferred to convert loot into goods that could be easily transported and sold. But then comes an intriguing question. If pirate life was so dangerous and uncertain, why did some men remain at sea for decades? The answer lies in a combination of factors that created an almost addictive dependence. First, freedom. After experiencing a life where their opinions mattered, where they could vote on important decisions, where they were respected for their skills rather than their social origin, returning to normal life became almost impossible. Ex-pirates who tried to live as ordinary citizens often felt suffocated by the rigid social hierarchies of the time. Second, camaraderie. Bonds formed between men who constantly saved each other's lives were stronger than traditional families. Many pirates considered their crew true brothers, something they rarely found on land. Third, adrenaline. After years living in constant excitement, alternating between mortal danger and euphoria of victory, everyday life seemed unbearably boring. Some ex-pirates reported feeling dead inside when trying to live peacefully, but perhaps the most important factor was the lack of viable alternatives. Pirates were wanted criminals. Even those who wished to leave life at sea faced execution if captured. This reality created a cycle. The longer they remained pirates, the harder it became to leave that life. The consequences of this impossibility to leave manifested in disturbing ways. Many veteran pirates developed what we would today recognize as severe post-traumatic stress symptoms. Insomnia, nightmares, seemingly unprovoked violent outbursts, alcohol abuse as self-medication, all were common among men who had spent years living under constant tension. Some sought relief in superstitious rituals they developed. Almost every pirate ship had its own luck traditions, specific amulets, songs to be sung before battles, spiritual cleansing rituals after deaths. These practices served both to create a sense of control over the uncontrollable and to strengthen bonds among crew members. Medicine aboard was another area where reality and superstition mixed in a fascinating way. Pirates had no access to trained doctors, so they developed practical knowledge of treatment that was at once surprisingly effective and completely mistaken. Treatment of battle wounds, for example, evolved through brutal trial and error. Pirates knew that quick amputations could save lives when limbs were severely injured. They developed cauterization techniques with hot irons that, although primitive, often prevented fatal infections. Some even knew medicinal properties of plants found on tropical islands. But at the same time, they believed certain diseases were caused by bad air or curses from dead enemies. Treatments could include everything from bloodletting to elaborate rituals involving burning specific herbs. The interesting thing is that some of these superstitious remedies actually worked, not for the reasons they thought, but due to coincidence or chemical properties they didn't understand. Food was another constant challenge that deeply shaped the pirate experience. Contrary to the popular image of plenty after every loot, the reality was chronic scarcity, alternating with periods of excessive abundance. How do you keep food fresh for weeks on a tropical sea without refrigeration? The answer involved preservation techniques that were both ingenious and disgusting. Salted meat was a staple, but often deteriorated to the point of being nearly inedible. Hard biscuits were infested with worms, which pirates learned to ignore or even consider as extra protein. Fresh water was so precious it was often mixed with rum, not just for flavor, but because alcohol helped kill bacteria. When they managed to capture a ship with fresh supplies, pirates indulged in food orgies that could last for days. Men who had survived weeks on spoiled rations suddenly had access to fresh fruit, quality meat, and fine wines. These occasions became almost religious celebrations, moments of pure joy that starkly contrasted with their usual privations. But then, what kind of man thrived in this extreme environment? Analysis of historical records reveals interesting patterns. It wasn't necessarily the most violent or cruel who became respected leaders, but those who balanced courage with practical wisdom. Successful pirate captains often possessed skills we would today associate with modern CEOs: the ability to make quick decisions under pressure, the talent to motivate teams, skill in negotiation and diplomacy, and above all, technical competence in their fields. The difference was that their offices were ship decks rocking in stormy seas, and their business meetings often involved cannons and swords. Edward Teach, better known as Blackbeard, exemplifies this complexity. Although historically portrayed as a bloodthirsty monster, evidence suggests he rarely killed unnecessarily. His terrifying reputation was carefully cultivated through theatrics. He literally set his beard on fire before battles to look demonic. This psychological intimidation often prevented bloodshed, as enemies surrendered before fighting. But what was the ultimate fate of these extraordinary men? The reality is very few pirates died of old age. Most met violent ends, some in battle, others on the gallows, many from tropical diseases or accidents at sea. Those lucky enough to survive often faced an impossible dilemma: how to reintegrate into a society that viewed them as monsters. A few managed. Henry Morgan eventually received a royal pardon and became governor of Jamaica. Jean Lafitte reportedly helped Andrew Jackson at the Battle of New Orleans and lived his last years as a respectable citizen. But these were rare exceptions. Most pirates trying to leave the sea life ended up captured and executed. This impossibility of escape created a peculiar mindset. Veteran pirates often developed a fatalistic philosophy, mixing resignation with defiance. They knew they would probably die young and violently, so they chose to live at maximum intensity while they could. This attitude influenced everything from how they spent money to how they handled relationships. Speaking of relationships, that was another area where pirate life created unique situations. Although most pirates were men, there were notable exceptions. Anne Bonny and Mary Red are the most famous, but records suggest other women also chose this life, often disguised as men. These women faced obvious extra challenges, but were often respected for their combat and navigation skills. Their male peers, after initial shock at discovering their true identity, often accepted them as equals. In an environment where competence was literally a matter of life or death, gender became secondary. But perhaps the most fascinating aspect of pirate life was how it functioned as a kind of radical social experiment. In an era when social mobility was nearly impossible and birth determined destiny, pirate ships offered something revolutionary: true meritocracy. A runaway slave could become a respected quartermaster if he proved his competence. An illiterate peasant could assume command if he showed natural leadership. Ruined aristocrats were treated like any other rookie until they proved their worth. It was a society where actions mattered more than origins. This extreme meritocracy created intense loyalties, but also fierce competition. Men who in normal society would never have leadership chances suddenly aspired to command positions. This possibility of social rise, combined with constant dangers, created an emotional intensity few other environments could match. In the end, when we try to truly understand what it was like to live on a pirate ship, we must accept it was a fundamentally different human experience from anything we know today. It was life lived at the absolute limit, physically, emotionally, socially. These men and women chose, or were forced to choose, an existence where every day was a bet against death, where total freedom came at the price of permanent isolation from civilized society, where unimaginable riches alternated with extreme deprivation. Maybe that's why pirates continue to fascinate our imaginations centuries later. They represent something lost in modern societies: the possibility of living completely outside established rules, of creating their own laws, of betting everything on a life of absolute adventure. Of course, they also represent the terrible price of that freedom: constant violence, premature death, the impossibility of lasting relationships, and the ever-present threat of capture and execution. It was a Faustian bargain few of us would make today, but one that at the time offered the only alternative for thousands of desperate men escaping lives of oppression and poverty. The true life on a pirate ship was neither the Hollywood romance nor the absolute horror we sometimes imagine. It was something more complex, an intense human experience combining the best and worst of human nature in an environment where every decision could mean the difference between life and death, between wealth and misery, between freedom and slavery, and perhaps it is precisely this complexity, this fundamental contradiction between freedom and imprisonment, between camaraderie and violence, between democracy and tyranny, that makes pirate life such a fascinating chapter in human history. They were, above all, men and women trying to survive and find meaning in a world that offered them few alternatives, and their story continues to teach us about the extremes to which the human spirit can be pushed when faced with extraordinary circumstances.